In this episode, we're going to discuss seller financing, when it's appropriate, the pros and cons for the seller, the buyer, as well as the lender, and then answer a question that we got this last week with regards to a seller note is, when can you use it as a down payment and or can it be considered as equity in a transaction? The answer to that is it depends, so stick around. Now, we've dedicated this channel to the concept that the more you know, the better decisions that you'll make. So join me as I discuss buying, financing, growing, and selling privately held businesses. If you're a business owner, a first-time business buyer, or a trusted advisor, you've come to the right place. So if you enjoy this episode, hit like and subscribe, and let's get started. Seller financing. When is it appropriate? Well, there's basically four separate categories where seller financing may become appropriate. And the first is when a business doesn't qualify for an institutional or an SBA loan. The second is that it may be customary for certain types of service businesses, especially things like accounting practices, bookkeeping practices, pest control, things where there are a lot of customers and they could be on contracts, and that transfer of customer becomes ultimately important as to the value of that business within the first 6 to 12 months. Third, the lender may actually require some level of seller financing to lower their exposure with risk. And then finally, the buyer may request it to offset some of the reps and warranties in the purchase and sale agreement. And we'll get into that in a bit. When the business will not qualify for an institutional loan. Now, there are three instances that come to mind that could trigger this. And the first is that the business may have really high levels of customer concentration. So if a business has 50, 60, 70% of the revenue of that business tied to one client, the lender may just view it as too risky. And the only way to put that together would be with hopefully a combination of substantial down payment, seller note, and maybe some level of institutional financing. The other one that kind of mirrors this is the inconsistency of a company's cash flow. If the company's cash flow in the historic 3 to 5 years is just all over the place, a larger down payment and or a combination of down payment and seller note may be appropriate. And then finally, there are just certain industries where the SBA and or commercial financing is not available. And one that comes to mind is anything related to marijuana, at least in the state of Oregon, where marijuana is legal to grow and dispense, but any of those businesses aren't eligible for banking, let alone an SBA or an institutional loan. Any of the businesses that deal directly with them are also not eligible. For instance, I just had a farm supply store that is a retail establishment that dealt specifically with growers in Southern Oregon, and they were not eligible, even though they didn't grow, didn't touch the product, weren't eligible for an SBA loan. The only way to sell it is with 100% seller financing. The next one is customary with certain businesses. So for instance, a couple of three that come to mind are bookkeeping, accounting firms, and believe it or not, pest control, where you're dealing with a large customer base, and those customers service kind of rolls over on a yearly or annual, semi-annual basis. It's fairly customary to have a fairly large seller note to offset the risk of those customers going away or not coming back for services upon the sale of a business. And then the third one is just the lender may view, for a combination of facts, some of we've already talked about, a lower loan to value, which is either cash or a combination of cash and a seller note. And then finally, the buyer may require some level of seller note or seller financing to offset any reps or warranties in the purchase and sale agreement. So, for instance, rep and warranty could be that all of the accounts receivable are collectible, and say you only are able to collect 50% of them, the buyer is. So they would use that seller note as an offset against that rep and warranty that was made by the seller. There are also some other situations. So it can be appropriate and is standard practice for a variety of reasons. And for buyers, it is a great way to offset some risk and ensure that the value of the transaction gets completed. And for sellers, if done correctly and your business is well put together and clean, doesn't represent a lot of risk, and you can defer some of your payments over time with interest. Pros and cons. Let's start with the seller. The obvious pro here is that the seller can defer income from the sale of the business over a period of time. Now, seller notes, when done with SBA lending, usually match the same term as the SBA note. So for instance, if the SBA loan is 10 years, then the seller note has to be 10 years and is probably going to yield about the same interest rate as that SBA note. The con is that you'll be in second position behind the SBA lender, and the lender is going to secure as much as they possibly can with regards to the to that loan. So they'll probably put a second lien on the borrower's house, as well as obviously securing the business. So you're in that second lien position, and as long as the business continues to operate, you should be fine and get your payments. For the buyer, the pros really start with tying the seller to the business. So as you go through that transition, if you have a seller note in place, the seller should be motivated to help that buyer through transition with customers, accounting, whatever the needs are, to make sure that that business gets off to a good start with the buyer. The other thing is it can add some flexibility. For instance, we have seen where payments on the seller note are deferred through that first year, helping the buyer with some of that cash flow issues that they may face in their first year of operation. And then two, also tying it to a clawback provision. So if you've got high customer concentration in a business, part of the note may be offset, or what we call in the business a clawback. If the customers don't transition with that business, some of that note may be forgiven, and because of obviously loss of revenue. So, and then lastly, with the buyer, it may help with the lender. So the lender may look for a seller note and or a larger down payment, and so that they're comfortable with the transaction. So the buyer's got several reasons for doing it: tying the seller back to the business for a period of time, clawback for certain customers, certain situations, whether it's with the purchase and sell agreement, and then it may help them get loan approval with the lender. For the lender, there's really just nothing more than pros. So it obviously helps reduce risk in the transaction to the lender, thereby lowering the loan amount. Buyer's usual down payment is about 15%. Traditionally, we see a seller note of 10%, and so therefore the lender is at 75% loan to value. Now, they may require a larger down payment, and they don't care if you're doing it in cash or putting a larger seller note in play to reduce their risk even further. So again, if the business is well represented, turnkey management, no customer concentration, good cash flow issues, there shouldn't be any reason for the lender to ask for either a larger down payment or a bigger seller note over a period of time. Can a seller note be used as a down payment? And the answer is sometimes. So we have a situation right now where we have a company, the employee would like to buy the company from the owners of retirement age, and would just like to retire. The buyer doesn't have any substantial amount of down payment. So the way we structured this transaction is we put a 15% seller note on standby for the full entire length of the SBA loan. So there can be no payments, and that note can't even be considered to start those payment streams until the SBA loan is fully paid off. So can it be used as a down payment? For purposes of the transaction, it can. It's still debt and still will need to be paid off by the buyer over a period of time. So that's the only instance that we know where a seller note can be used as a down payment. So there you have it, the good, the bad, and the ugly about seller financing and when it's appropriate. The pros and cons for the buyer, the seller, and the lender. And then when you can actually use seller financing as a down payment to obtain an SBA loan. So I hope you found this video interesting, and we'll see you on the next one.